Again, good evening to everyone. I am Lee Butler, the Distinguished Service Professor of Theology and Psychology, and I welcome you to Chicago Theological Seminary, where we're committed to preparing religious leaders to become leaders for the next. We're gathered this evening to celebrate the publication of Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis, by Dr. Zachary Moon, Chicago Seminary's Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. Tonight, we explore the concept of moral injury as the next necessary issue for religious leadership and to reflect together on the importance of institutional chaplaincy for responding compassionately to moral emotions like guilt, shame, disgust, and contempt. Dr. Moon is a stellar Master of Divinity graduate of Chicago Seminary. Hey. He came to CTS with a significant part of his religious formation having been shaped in the context of Quakerism, which meant he came with an active social justice witness and concern for issues related to community life. He was so committed to social justice that on November 4th, 2008, he had the audacity to skip my class so he could be in Grant Park to hear a history-making acceptance speech. Toward the end of his coursework at Chicago Seminary, he began to focus his ministerial preparation to work with veterans. This specialized passion and commitment led to the two of us developing an independent study where he explored the traumas of war and the re-entry of returning veterans. That was the genesis of his scholarly interest that contributed to his first publication, Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families. His work has been critical and insightful as he has pushed himself to develop new paradigms of care for veterans. So without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I present to you the Rev Dr. Zachary Moon, who will introduce us to his latest book, Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis.
Y'all, just in case you don't know, no one remains unscathed from a Dr. Lee Butler introduction. And if you don't know, you will know. Thank you. Thank you for that, that generous introduction and that somewhat unexpected stroll down memory lane. It is a real pleasure to be able to celebrate this publication in this community. I will confess to you that until very recently, I didn't want to think or speak of this book. I wanted it to just be somewhere else. You know, you just sit over there in the corner and think about what you did. Writing books can be like that sometimes, and by the time I had gotten to the end, I was quite worn out, particularly as the process of publication kind of unfolds in the ways that it does. But as I took a look at it over the last few days, I can say that I feel better about it now than I did a few weeks ago, and so I'm glad to be able to celebrate with you. I think I have now been able to reconnect with the spirit of celebration and appreciation and gratitude, so I'm very glad to be here. There are some very important people to me here tonight, and so y'all know who you are, and I just want to say it means a lot to me that you all came, that you all are here. I know there are any number of things going on in Chicago tonight, and I'm really grateful that you all would stick around here to celebrate this opportunity with me. So this book is really wanting to do a few things. The work on moral injury as a kind of particular niche within the trauma studies field at large, depending on where you want to begin the origin story of where this concept gets going, we're talking about a concept that's still in the, sort of smelly high school days, okay? I mean, only, kind of 15 years old. And what that means is moral injury is still figuring out who it wants to be when it grows up, right? Folks haven't all gotten a hold of it just yet to kind of sort through what a consensus definition is or any of that. But where I see some current deficits in the discourse on moral injury is some of what this book seeks to speak to. Not to insert a better definition or answer all the questions, but at least to lay some claims that I hope will be useful to this kind of motley, crude community of scholars and faith leaders and veterans and other survivors of trauma who all have something very necessary to bring to the conversation. But those deficits that I saw, among them, maybe the first and foremost one was, we're talking about moral injury, but nobody has quite said what they mean by moral. Okay, so if you come and you say to me, Zachary, I broke my arm, and I don't actually know what an arm is, that might be an important question to ask. I need to know what your arm is if I'm going to understand the site of where this traumatic experience has taken place. So there's a way in which the claim of moral injury hasn't even yet gotten to the place where it knows itself well enough to say, and this is what I mean. Now, y'all here at CTS, you know what a dangerous thing it is to make kind of essential assumptions about, oh, well, we all know what we mean by moral, right? What we mean by moral is probably what some, sexually repressed white guy who spent too much of his life in some pulpit somewhere said morality was, okay? And so all of a sudden we have just a gaping deficit in how this can reach and resonate with folks in terms of actual experience. So where I really try to enter into the conversation is saying, whether you are interested at all at what I've got to say about what I think we could say is what that moral site of the injury is, let's have that conversation. Let's disagree with each other. Let's work it out to figure out when we say moral injury, what do we imagine that site of injury really is? Now, what I try to propose is to try to develop a concept that provides enough dynamism and enough fluidity that we can kind of bring into our thinking some of the post-colonial and intersectionality thinking that is so formative for the scholarship really across multiple disciplines in our time. Can we think about morality as not something that you go and pick up a six-pack at the corner store and then take it home and you've got it for your whole life? Right? Moral identity is not static like that. It's not material like that. It's this more complicated kind of thing. And so where at least the areas that I want to map in thinking about moral identity and the concept that I use here, I call moral orienting systems. So when we say moral identity, can we understand the ways in which morality is this kind of fluid, adaptable, responsive kind of system of orientation and disorientation and reorientation. Something's active in the midst of what this is. And it has everything to do, in my estimation, with being able to function and to survive in certain moral spaces. So how my moral orienting system might be working it out when I put on my three-piece and come here to teach class or to, celebrate a book at CTS is going to be a little bit different, when I got my pajamas on at 2 p.m. because my small children do, and they're climbing all over me and trying to, be like that, right? There's ways in which we function differently in different kinds of spaces. So can we think constructively about how space and context and circumstance and situation are all at play here in terms of how this works? But in terms of mapping, for like if you were in, kind of bringing it, closer to home for thinking of disciplines like chaplaincy work or pastoral counseling, if you were with somebody, could you be listening to, and the three that I want to track here in a particular way are values, beliefs, and behaviors. And again, none of those in a sort of, standoff by itself kind of way, but how are the things that sort of cluster in those three areas meaningful to the person as is made substantive by the meaningful relationships in their life. So I think what we will find is that when we say, what are these meaningful values or ways of living these beliefs, the ones that really comprise one's moral orienting system aren't something that you just read a book about one time and you thought that was an interesting idea, right? Here we have to incorporate family of origin. We have to think about those meaningful mentors and teachers, right? Those formative relationships that we've had. And the ways in which, even if those relationships are distant, even if those relationships are toxic and life-limiting, how they have informed what our values and beliefs are, right? There are many of us who carry certain beliefs and values and behaviors because we didn't like how that formative person in our life did that thing. And so we are living our lives in a way that seems to say, I ain't gonna be that way, right? I've got to figure out something that doesn't look like that doesn't shout like that doesn't get angry like that. And so let me try to do it in this other kind. We're responding. And so when I say meaningful, I don't mean everything's good in this relationship, but I mean that it's meaningful. It's formative and formidable in these kinds of ways. Now, part of what I want to do in getting us to kind of be able to visualize moral identity in this system is also to recognize that folks have a kind of web of meaning that connects all of this stuff together. But that depending on what kind of context and situation you find yourself, that web is going to be interrupted and disrupted and all kind of manner of things happening to it, depending on what kind of situation and context you are in, right? So, I mean, again, just put myself on the spot, right? As someone who inhabits a body that has all kind of social, political, economic, educational privileges, there are many spaces that I can go into that I more or less am buffered from some of those interruptions and disruptions to my moral orienting system, to the degree that I might think to myself, man, my oral orienting system's really got it going on, doesn't it, right? Because I'm just not feeling any kind of stress at all. I'm just coming to work every day. I'm just sitting in traffic. I mean, it's all good, right? Because in fact, the context, the world that has been constructed and developed over time has actually done so that my oral orienting system feels real good all the time. That's not true for everybody. We have to be able to recognize that if we're really going to even imagine that we could have an effective response to people who experience moral stress and moral injury. We have to be thinking in those kinds of dynamic ways. We got to be recognizing that the realities of what it is to inhabit the city of Chicago is a fundamentally different moral situation if you have black or brown skin than if you have white skin, right? So we can't talk about moral injury in the city of Chicago without talking about racism. Among these deficits, in terms of what's happening with the moral injury work, the ones that the book responds to beyond this point of what is this site of moral identity that we're really talking about has been fractured, has been traumatized, has been injured in this way, is that because this conversation emerges from largely a clinical or medical conversation around post-traumatic stress disorder, which more often than not is really focused in on acute traumatic events, what I call bad Tuesday, right? I was good on Monday, and then Tuesday happened, and then by the time Wednesday came around, I was a mess, right? That's more or less how we are visualizing trauma at this degree. Now, you got some folks who are starting to push back against that, who are saying, now, wait a second. How do we understand intergenerational and transgenerational trauma? How do we recognize, and actually we've got ample science now that says that trauma inscribes your very DNA in a transgenerational way. That's not Bad Tuesday, right? We can't fully understand that if we just think trauma happens on Bad Tuesday. But much of the moral injury conversation is still adhering to that Bad Tuesday model. We're defining it by saying what kind of Bad Tuesday could give you moral injury instead of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so part of what I'm advocating for here is we need to take a much more broad and inclusive perspective on not only what the site of one's moral identity is, what I'm calling moral orienting systems, but also an intergenerational and transgenerational perspective on how moral injury works. So if we're talking about military service, and I will talk about military service as a part of this conversation because it has been the primary space where this conversation has happened, right? I think we all are in common agreement that war is a horrific and traumatizing thing. So let's go over there and study war trauma to better understand trauma, right? That's our MO here, right? We recognize that's trauma space. We'll study trauma over there. But I don't want to just stay over there because that's not the only place that trauma is happening. It's also not the only place that moral stress and moral injury are happening. But let me speak for a moment about the military context, because part of what's being lost, part of what's missing right now in the conversation that I'd like us to talk about is who are these siblings of ours before they join the military, right? So what if we took that Monday and we extended it out for the probably 18 years in most cases before that person ever signed on the dotted line and became a military recruit? If we do not understand who that person is as a human being, and I would say as a beloved child of God, we cannot understand even the acute traumatic events without understanding everything that's come before. And I will testify to you, having served as a military chaplain, having worked with veterans for a number of years, I have yet to meet a military service member who was not a trauma survivor before they joined the military. So for us to imagine war is a traumatizing thing, let's talk about war trauma, is just immediately to lose sight of how many trauma survivors, in fact, are wearing our nation's uniforms tonight. The other thing that isn't yet, I think, sort of fully in the conversation that I do some work on in this book is to really grapple with what is happening with military training, right? Because even those of us who haven't been through it, right, we've seen enough of the movies, right? There's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of push-ups, there's sort of iconic things that sort of stick in our mind in terms of what happens in military training. Well, a phenomenal thing happened to me as a graduate of this esteemed institution. I trundled myself off to military training after getting an MDiv here. And let me tell you, it was quite something. And it was really something to have studied with liturgically, religiously, ritually astute people for 3 years before I went to military training. Because I'm knocking out those push-ups just like everybody else, but I'm thinking to myself, man, there's a lot of ritual going on right now. I'm having this person shout over my shoulder, and maybe not necessarily saying all the things you want your pastor to say on Sunday, but I'm thinking to myself, there's a certain kind of liturgy that's being conveyed here, and so I'm starting to think about, wow, what is it that's going on here? Why am I standing in this awkward position for a prolonged amount of time, holding a tiny manual that fits in my pocket that has all of these values and commitments and mission statements, all these things that I need to know backwards and forwards, that I need to be able to shout out while I'm doing those push-ups? What's going on with that? Well, if I come back to that moral orienting system, something is being suggested here. And when I say suggested, I mean in the most fierce kind of term suggested. Not suggested in a way that we might sit in a classroom and have an astute professor say to us, hey, you should think about reading the Bible this way. But instead, what if Dr. Terrell was training you up to do systematic theology, but you were having to knock out push-ups while you were doing that? Part of what would be happening, and you might actually be a better student if this were happening, part of what's happening is your entire physiocognitive system is getting pumped up with energy, right? So we think about the brain as something up here, right? When I say physiocognitive, I mean our bodies are our brains, okay? So I'm getting this all juiced up with all this energy, right? And the sweat's dripping off me, and somebody's shouting things at me, and I'm thinking, God, what kind of place is this for a Quaker kid from Berkeley, California? That's what I'm thinking. But what's happening in my body is I'm learning this in some kind of deep, deep way. And what I have come to claim is that I think among the things that are happening in military training, we ought to be fiercely conscious of what's happening in somebody's moral orienting system. Because if we begin to lean into that study, we also recognize what happens in your first 24 hours, right? You get there, you hand over all of your personal effects, right? Track meaning with me here, all of your personal effects. You get to call your mama, but you don't get to have a conversation with her. You get to read from a script that says, Mama, I got here, I'm safe, goodbye. Track meaning with me now. They do something to your hair, or at least most of us, they do something to your hair, right? They're taking away some of the particularity of your humanity. You're not getting to wear what you want to. You're wearing what they tell you to wear, right? A great deal is also being taken away from you. Distance is being created in that meaningful web of moral sense. You're being separated from that. Now, at least in this generation of military service, they're also telling you many times a day, most American citizens weren't willing to sign up for their country, but you were, right? They are consistently and persistently crafting a very, very deeply embedded us narrative, okay? Which, and this could be for another night in its entirety, but without a fierce sense of us, lethality is not possible. Y'all hear me? Y'all know somebody in Chicago PD? If you do not have a sense of us at that kind of level, lethality is not possible, right? So folks want to say, oh, what about the creating enemies? What about the otherizing here? That's only half of the equation, right? There is dehumanization that happens with that perceived other that has to do with lethality. If you do not believe that there is something uniquely precious and ordained about this us, lethality is not possible. So when you wonder why the military has a hard time or a police department has a hard time holding itself accountable, remember that us identity. It's protective, it's defensive, and it's everything when it comes to this identity here. There's a third piece. So we've talked about what I call in the book first life. Then when I talk about moral training, the moral training of military training and what's happening with recruit training. And then I want to focus in on a third piece. And the third piece is, what is it like to come home? Because part of what's happening here by really focusing in on that bad Tuesday that happened to you while you were in Fallujah is that we're not thinking about how morally stressful it is to come home. And again, we need to come back to thinking about these different moral worlds. Part of what military training is equipping folks to do is to function within a very different moral world than what they knew before. But y'all, they're not trying to do anything for you on the back end. They're just slapping a plane ticket in your hand and say, go kiss your mama, right? So again, draw up some of those images of military training. Think about the intensity of what that is and the intensity of the learning, the social learning of what that is on somebody's body. And then imagine probably all of that only gets more kind of deeply meaningful as you're actually doing the thing, right? After training, right? It's not becoming less meaningful to you in all accounts. And then imagine how devastating that quick transition between that military world and that civilian world might be. How it might be difficult to talk to your loved ones, not feeling like we're connected in the way that we used to be connected, not feeling like we value in the way that we used to, anticipating certain kinds of moral judgments about things that I was involved in. I don't want to talk about those things because I sense, I perceive that those were not acceptable things in this moral world. And even if they were normalized, even if they were authorized in a military moral world, they're not okay here, and I know that, and so that's things I got to put away. Well, sometimes those are the most heartbreaking things. Those are the things we need to be talking about. Those are the very things that civilian society needs to be reckoning with if we are going to continue to send people to do this. And those are the things that we most often don't talk about. Now, what I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about in this book are the bad Tuesdays, because we already got a whole bookshelf that are willing to tell those stories, are promoting those stories, and in some cases tokenizing those stories, are saying, let's tell these particularly horrific stories because there's something kind of gruesome and compelling about those kind of war stories. So part of what I'm trying to do here is give us the infrastructure necessary to take on more effective care approaches, right? Whether we're thinking about how to do that as a faith community, whether we're thinking about how to do that in chaplaincy and one-on-one encounters, whether we're thinking about being an institution of higher education that might have some folks come through our doors to be students who might have some particular things that they're bringing with them that we might want to have kind of clear sense of what that is. But I also hope that in broadening all of this, that we also have a sense that this is not something that there's anything necessarily particular about military service to this. That wherever you see a person whose moral orienting system is being disrupted and wrung out by the situation that they're in, you will find moral stress, you will find moral injury. Now, the most awful way to track where is their moral injury is to track where the suicide rates are. So I've already mentioned the Chicago PD. You might be aware that they have a very high suicide rate, right? There are many other professions where we don't talk about the suicide rates, but we might be very regularly talking about things like burnout, right? With public school teachers, with nurses, right? Is there something in those environments that structurally speaking is working against the moral values, beliefs, and behaviors of the teachers, of the nurses? Now, I can think of a few, and probably you can too if you have known folks. But when we think about what is leading people to burnout in these situations, follow what's happening there with the moral stress, and I think you will find some information there. And I'll use public school as an example. We are all aware probably that most educators in our society are not compensated very well. What is compelling them into that vocation is also a sense of avocation, is a sense that there is something important and significant for me to do. Read meaning, track meaning here. And yet we are a part of a grotesque social experiment on our most vulnerable, and by this I mean our children, that continues to move in the direction of standardized testing, among other things, that has no basis in any kind of science that says that this is going to be an effective way to educate a child. Who knows that better than anybody but that school teacher? So here is a school teacher whose moral identity is deeply rooted in this vocation of teaching, who is in an environment, who is in a situation where day after day they are mandated to do things that no one can justify on moral grounds, right? Do we wonder why those folks get burned out? Follow the moral stress in these kinds of situations. I'm only scratching the surface on that because, in fact, by and large, that work hasn't yet been done. But I hope that in this next 5 and 10 years, there will be more and more folks from more and more contexts who will be able to use some of these concepts to recognize, oh no, yes, war is one very clear place where this kind of moral trauma is taking place. It is certainly not the only. And we necessarily need to think about the ways in which moral trauma are affecting folks. I think I'll open it to question and answers because you guys have already heard my voice a lot, so I don't need to read from the book, right? We don't need to have story time with Dr. Moon tonight. Let me just ask if there are questions. Please, sir.
So, as you were talking about particularly moral injury, what I was reminded of, what I was reminded of was pledging and hazing.
Yes.
Back in the Dark Ages. No, I mean literally, back in the Dark Ages, before there was such a word as hazing.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you are aware of any kind of reflection or literature, and that reflects on this sort of reality, particularly back in the days when people pledged for 2 months. Mm. They wore a uniform for 2 months. They regularly went through periodic senses of hazing, because the entire sense was, as we used to say, to break you down, right, so we could build you back up. Right. Do you know of any literature that might be connected with that whole sort of culture? Of fraternal culture.
Yeah, I don't know that literature, and I don't know how much it's been developed, President Ray. I think there, as you're alluding to, there's clear parallels to what's happening there. The highly ritualistic character of that, and again, whether it's pledges or whether it's recruits, the process of what it is there, and again, to even say getting broken down to get built up. That's too easy, right? That's too simple, even an equation to what's going on there. Something's being taken away, right? And there's any number of ways in which I think we can't underestimate, whether it's the opportunity to belong to a fraternity or whether it's to belong to a warrior culture. For any of you who have a television, you have seen military recruitment commercials. I mean, some of them just go all in. I remember this one from my childhood. There was this knight who had this big old sword, was just waving it. There was a dragon. There was a whole thing, and at the end, he turned into a Marine. Right? I mean, it was like it wasn't even trying to sort of bat an eye on what are we trying to right. So there's a way in which our human need to belong. To have a sense of that usness, that togetherness, that tribeness is I think deep in us in a way that we find, that we create, that we perpetuate, sometimes very unhealthy, very life-limiting ways to express that. And I think it's vitally important that we track not only the violence but also the power that gets scripted in those kinds of spaces.
Thanks, Zach. As I understand you, you begin by saying that moral injury is still in its nascent emergence. Just to further clarify the differentiation you're making between trauma and moral injury, as you see it, am I understanding correctly that trauma has too often been defined as temporal, momentary, and hence the post of the PTSD, whereas moral injury may be more long-term, embedded in a different way? Could you clarify that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, the shortest way to differentiate it is not what it looks like. Because if we're going to, again, sort of think clinically about symptoms, right, about sort of expressions of the aftermath of trauma, moral injury and PTSD can look identical to each other. So there's not something here that we're saying, oh, I see that, I know what that is. Where we begin to understand the crucial differences are if we're in the space to actually understand what the experience was, when someone's willing to share part of their story, to take that risk, and we are willing to reciprocate a kind of a risk to hear what that story is about, to hear what that experience is. The way to differentiate it is that as far as the diagnostic manual is concerned, PTSD is centrally a fear-based experience, right? Life threat, either real or perceived, to myself or someone who's very meaningful to me. Now, if the big sort of traumatic emotion is not fear, then it actually doesn't qualify in the way that the diagnostic manual wants to track it that way. Now, again, going back to that great trauma laboratory of war, the Department of Defense now recognizes that there are at least 3 alternative trauma paths to PTSD, although in terms of how the diagnosis works, it doesn't get there. and they may have even done more since I was out of uniform. But when I was doing trainings for folks in uniform, we were talking about traumatic grief, loss as trauma, as being different. We were talking about moral injury, although moral injury was a non-starter in terms of the branding. The language of it was problematic for folks. So they rebranded it and called it inner conflict. So they were talking about all this same concept, but they had rebranded it. And in one way, in another way, most disturbing, this sort of fourth stream that we have been able to identify and acknowledge is basically traumatic fatigue. And we have learned this in the worst possible way by continuing to deploy and redeploy the same service members again and again, that whether they were ever in a life-threatening situation, whether they ever experienced traumatic loss, whether they ever had any inner conflict, that just by the process of being deployed and deployed and deployed and deployed, that they could exhibit all of those PTSD symptoms, right? That the traumatic exhaustion, fatigue, at that level could be that kind of trauma. So the thing to track is what's going on with that experience. Because if we just look at the symptom level, we might not actually understand what's going on. And so there are lots of folks with moral injury who have a VA diagnosis of PTSD. Because in fact, they're having a hard time sleeping at night. They're always jacked up on adrenaline. They're driving their motorcycle down the highway with no helmet on because they're trying to re-experience something in a parasuicidal behavior kind of way, right? I mean, so all of this kind of stuff can look that way and can even get diagnosed that way. But the story that's underneath, and again, this is why I think it's crucially important, the work of chaplaincy and the work of faith communities is, can we be in relationship with folks that's willing to take the risk to actually hear people's stories, the sometimes ugly, sometimes not all put together truthness of their stories, to be impacted by it, in the hearing of it, because we'll find that actually trauma has a lot more sources that generate these symptoms than just a life threat kind of experience. The thing to track with moral injury, as Dr. Butler alluded to in the introduction, would be inward evaluating moral emotions like shame and guilt, something I've done or failed to do. And again, think about the kind of moral evaluation. So shame and guilt are something that I did or didn't do, or externalized moral judgments. Something that this person who did or didn't do, and so what I feel now is a sense of disgust. What I feel now is a sense of contempt. You're tracking anger as a part of that moral evaluation, right? This is not a gentle moral evaluation. This is a sharp anger, maybe even raged kind of evaluation. And the other thing to pay attention to there is how responsibility is working for folks, right? If I do something but I don't feel responsible, I don't feel guilt or shame for it. The trick here becomes, what often happens in the ways that we approach these injuries is we say, gosh, I'm hearing your story. You know, you're not really that's not on you. You're not responsible for that. And in doing so, even though, again, what we're trying to do is alleviate a sense of responsibility that we can see generating guilt or shame, what we're actually doing is guilting guilt and shaming shame. And y'all, we don't need to live in a world that has less sense of responsibility. Should I say that again? Right? We don't want to be alleviating responsibility, so we have to track the responsibility. What that responsibility is actually calling folks to is reconciliation. It's calling us to reparation. It's calling us to truth speaking. So if what we say is, you're having a hard time, let me take that away by taking away the responsibility, in my estimation, actually betrays the very evolutionary function of moral emotions, which is inherently pro-social. Something has been broken in the moral covenant of this society in which I am a part, and it must be repaired. Right? That energy is drawing us toward that work of reparation. If we start taking ourselves off the hook on stuff, we're actually getting further and further away from doing just that. So again, one of the reasons why just trying to get folks help isn't really the fullness of what I mean when I talk about the necessary work that's here. That when we really are willing to hear these stories in a nation that is has been at war nearly every year of its existence, right? Part of the conversation that we continue to avoid and deny and distance ourselves from are these moral dimensions. And what's happening now, by and large, in my estimation, is we have a very, very small number of American citizens shouldering all of the moral responsibility for that war making. Meanwhile, last week, we all paid our taxes. We foot the bill, but not too many of us, in my estimation, felt the necessary moral injury that we ought to have felt at that moment of signing the paperwork. Please.
I served in the Army in Vietnam in '71, and it took me 40 years to come to grips with my moral injury. I didn't know how to name it. The first time I thought about it was during constructive theology here. And then I became aware that there was something wrong, and feelings were welling up that I had never thought about before. And I've eventually dealt with it, but that concerned me. And I've talked to other guys who have had similar problems, similar experiences, where now in the twilight of our years, as the hair gets gray, we start thinking about what we did. And we're embarrassed and we're ashamed of the things we did. And can you comment on that?
I can, and part of this from my experience is I have a brother who also works as a chaplain. He does end-of-life, palliative, and hospice care, and he's dealing with as much moral injury as I ever did in uniform. And it's some of those same stories. Part of what I hope that we can be more effective in is recognizing that when it comes to where this stuff comes to the surface, that situation and context are so crucial to that. So my sense in hearing just even a bit of this story that you're willing to share with us is part of why it came to the surface here was that you were in a particular kind of space, in a particular kind of situation. Maybe you were asking certain kinds of questions, and in doing so, some of that came to the surface in a significant kind of way. Now, I would hope that part of it coming to the surface was also a sense of now's the time to do this work, right? Our bodies as human beings are the most, I mean, if you didn't believe in God and intelligent design, this would almost convince you, right? We are created to survive some of the most horrendous things. And it's remarkable to me the expansive and creative ways in which this physiocognitive self that we are can come up with doing it. My father, who was also in Vietnam in '69 and '70, cognitively, he disassociates with everything traumatic that's happened in his life. He and I were both nearly killed in a car accident about 15 years ago. And I was sharing this with him. He might be watching this, so Dad, good evening. It was so noticeable to me that in the days after that car accident, he kept asking me, what happened? What happened? What happened? Because the way in which his body has figured out how to deal with trauma is you just got to delete those files. There's pain there. There's agony there. There's anguish there. Delete those files, right? Now, we don't all work the same way, right? Folks respond differently. But part of what's happening there is how do we survive with this stuff? How do we get on to that next day? And rather than, what we often do is that we have some coping responses for folks that we say, oh, that person's doing a good job with their trauma. And we take a look at everybody else and we say, they're self-medicating, they're a problem drinker, they're parasuicidal, they're domestically violent, they're doing this, they have anger issues. That's probably the biggest one, right? That person has anger issues, right? All of those are the ways that we all know, those are the ways you're not supposed to be, right? But at least, I'm trying to think probably the numbers. I was working at the VA down in Atlanta, Georgia, the year after I got out of CTS, doing a CPE residency down there. And I was running these weekly groups for Vietnam vets with PTSD diagnoses. Some of them had been having trauma symptoms since they got back. But a bunch of them, their symptoms had just shown up. And you know the thing that held them together? They had just retired from their jobs. The jobs that they had been working 80 hours a week from the day they got back to the day they retired. And everybody that they were working with thought, damn, that guy, he's the hardest worker, he's the best worker, he's the most squared away, right? Our society took a look at that workaholism and they said, you made the transition successfully. And then the person retired, and then they couldn't sleep at night, and they were feeling jacked up all the time, and they were saying, what's going on, right? So there are ways in which within our cultural context, we have valued certain coping responses and said, isn't that wonderful? And other coping responses that we say, don't bring that around here. And I think instead what we need to do is open our eyes and say, what's happening here, right? We're not doing a great job of it, right? We don't need to say, your anger issues make me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. But we need to recognize what is it here that's going on in our human family. And if our ways of working that out and expressing that and recovering from that aftermath, aren't the most wonderful ways, okay. But let's start from a place of recognizing what it is that's going on here before we get to the place of saying, don't bring that around here, or let's get that guy another promotion. Because both of those folks are suffering. They're just suffering differently.
Dr. Moon, I'm curious about, you talked about responsibility and attending to moral injury, then calling us to reconciliation. And I'm wondering, so then is moral injury defined by what that person has experienced, or is there some kind of moral vision operating in the background that has assumptions about what is permissible and not permissible in war?
Yeah, so I think that's what I think this book begins to invite us to that conversation, Dr. Ringer. I think this is how we need to think not just about persons in an individual sort of sense, right, which so much of the clinical medical model just says, Dr. Ringer, what's going wrong right now? Let's get that fixed up. Let's get you some medicine for that, right? And totally renders invisible who my people are, who my community is. If we're willing to say that this is a moral injury, how can you not talk about who my people are? How can you not talk about the experiences that I've had, before all of this, gets laid out? At this point, the way that it's most often being treated is just like, well, it looks and smells and maybe acts a little bit like PTSD. So what we're going to do is try to address the symptoms, right? We got pills, you can't sleep at night. You're jacked up all the time. We got pills for that. Now we got pills for the pills, right? And that's what it ends up being. And it becomes a kind of trauma industrial complex in that way, right? You got a whole lot of different institutions who are positioning themselves to get paid and to get successful and to get headlines and all the rest of it. That's all positioned around this trauma industrial complex. Now, meanwhile, what it's doing is it's flattening everybody out to symptoms. Oh, you got those symptoms, I got these pills. Part of what this needs to be an invitation in terms of how are we engaging with trauma is saying, are we willing to hear the truth of what's happened here? And are we willing to really consider what moral responsibility looks like in a broader sense as a nation who continues to fund war, even if we only ask a few of our people to fight it? Then yes, we'd have to be able to take those conversations more broadly in that way. Please, ma'am.
I'm really reflecting on a number of different strands that are coming across here, and what's coming back to me is sort of the sense of disintegration and reintegration, and the way that behaviors and feelings and experiences are pathologized in one context and normative in others.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about whether the act of moral injury, the occasion of moral injury, is taking place at the point of joining the military or being decommissioned from the military, or both, because you're being broken down and disintegrated as you were when you came in and turned into another identity that's normative for military context, and then being rebroken and unsuccessfully, presumably, reintegrated into civilian life, and that moral injury may be taking place in both those junctures.
Yes.
And, so I'm thinking about, for example, a kid who becomes homeless, and needs to become habituated to the survival experiences of living on the street, and may become and experiences great trauma and moral injury in the experiences of becoming homeless and learning to cope in a completely alien environment.
Yes.
And then, at the point where they find another way, a social service agency or whatever, provides them with new structures.
Yes.
That can be as, we call it healing, but it can be as re-traumatizing to say that the things you did on the street, that were the things you had to do on the street, are things that are no longer acceptable in your new situation. And so I'm trying to think about the points of injury, and I'm still having a little trouble with this sort of that trauma can be facing outward or facing inward, but that the distinction between the moral injury piece, where you're having a disintegration of the structures that kept you going, the behaviors and structures that were operative for you in one life, that become dysfunctional and wrong, morally wrong in your next life. And then, especially when there's a second juncture where you're supposed to reintegrate into a completely different new self.
You got it. That's it. That's it. And again, part of this is to be able to really be much more attentive to what's happening in those transition moments, where certain structures are being taken away or lost or defeated. Other structures are being put into place. We are highly adaptable if we are to survive. So new values, beliefs, and behaviors will be adopted as a part of that. And it's not just as simple as saying, well, isn't it good for you, kid? Now you have a bed, right? Isn't that all that homelessness is? You just need a bed, right? So we'll just get that person a bed without recognizing, as you have said, the loss and the relearning that has taken place so that survival was possible, to even make it to that day, to be offered a bed. But a bed is like this, this like one material part. Sure, right. No, right. There's any number of things. There's any number of things that one would necessarily come to understand and participate in differently in these different spaces, right? Military training recognizes that, right? They say we can't take a civilian 18-year-old out of the shopping mall and drop them into Fallujah and have them be able to do their job. So we're going to have to do this so that they can do that. The problem is we don't have the social will to say we're not going to pick up somebody from Fallujah and drop them back in the shopping mall and think that everything's going to be okay, right? Our investment is getting them to do it, not actually investing in them getting home. So to me, the question, the parallel that you're drawing so magnificently is, does our care extend beyond getting that young person a bed to actually thinking about the total work of what that transition that transition is about? I knew a number of folks in the Marine Corps who had been around guns their whole life, right? Either guns in the home or guns in gang life on the street. And it was chaotic. It was guns plus chaos. So they took a look at the military and they said, well, this has got guns, but I already know about guns, but there's order here. So that looks safer to me than what I knew here. So something is drawing them in that way, but then we must not underestimate what it is to spit that person out of the Marine Corps back into those same streets with no certifiable skills to be able to get a job. And the only option we're giving them is to go down to the VA and see if they can get a PTSD diagnosis so that they can qualify for a percentage disability, right? That's where that industrial complex comes into play, right? What are we giving folks by way of options? If we don't understand where folks have come from, I don't actually, the notion that folks are gonna re-enter or reintegrate into what? Into an abusive home? Into a neighborhood that doesn't have any options? Into an economy that doesn't value my humanity? I mean, right? We can't just sort of think in simple ways about what it is for folks to get reintegrated when they get back. We've really got to wrestle with that. And I mean, I love the parallel that you're drawing with homelessness, because I think it draws up a number of things there that are both very comparable, but also very indicative of the work that we need to do, and maybe some of the limitations in the way in which certain kinds of charitable work is happening now that isn't necessarily taking into account the fullness of what that human situation is.
So I'm going to spin off that just a little bit, because this idea of reintegration is fascinating to me. And I'm thinking particularly about the moral gaze that exists in our respective faith communities and how that interplays with this. And by moral gaze, I mean, I would say it's probably safe to bet that the majority of us in this room come from places that disparage war, from churches that talk about peace, that have a very sort of that kind of area. We know that there are also many churches where patriotism is highly celebrated and where they send their members off to war. And encourage, in your book, there are several people who come out of communities that have actually almost jettisoned them into this sort of idea of doing this heroic deed. When these folks come back, the same as when someone is retrieved from the street, let's say, or comes out of prison, or any of these other sort of environments, they walk back into a community whose gaze has somehow or another affected their decision to get there. And I'm just thinking from a pastoral and a chaplaincy and activist, all of the different ways that we would be serving, how do we mitigate sort of reimposing our own values? And one of the challenges with the research about this is, if you're going to do research into trauma and you're coming from an anti-war stance, you're going to attribute certain, that's also discussed in the book. So how do we sort of mitigate that prejudice that really will come into play with us trying to be reintegrators and serving these folks who are coming back? That has to be our deepest concern.
Yes, and I think at least part of where I see faith communities and individuals being well-intentioned without being effective is that we haven't done our own work, right? The parallel that I sometimes draw around this is thinking about getting ready to go on a date with somebody and going to the library and reading a bunch of books about who you think they are. And then they show up for the date and you say, oh, let me impress you by all the books that I read about who I think you are, right? That date's not going to go well. If we instead think about how can I get myself ready to be in relationship, right? Whether it's to go on a date or any other kind of relationship is comparable, right? I got to be willing to do the work on my own stuff. I got to know who I am. I got to know what I'm bringing to this conversation. So much of the charitable work that's being done is so one-directional, right? The perception is our veterans are broken and we're not. We should do something for them, right? Right? And that's where you get all that moral responsibility pushed off on them too, right? Because we're saying we're fine, right? And so part of what could happen today is we could quit saying that to ourselves, and we could start talking about how cracked up we are, and start doing that work, which would make our communities much more responsive to folks of all kinds who know full well that they're cracked up. That could be part of it. The other thing is, if we actually showed up to be in relationship with somebody who knows that they've got some cracks in their life and was actually willing to hear that story, the transformation could come from there too, right? I mean, we could go ahead and do this work, or we could let somebody say, you know what, you need to do some work, right? Either way, we got to do some work, right? Either we can get ourselves out of bed and do it ourselves, or we can have somebody really challenge us to do that. But it's all going to come back to relationship, right? And it's very clear to me, there's a reason why faith communities aren't showing up for people in the military, right? It's also the same reason why they're not showing up for a lot of other people in our society, right? It's because they say, you can come here, but you got to act like me. You got to worship like me. You got to read Bible like me. You got to want to sing the same songs I want to sing. You want to be quiet like me. If you're like us Quakers, you say, no, if you can't sit here for an hour and be quiet, don't come around, right? There's something, right? And the implication is, of course, we're happy that you're here, but you got to do as we do, right? Now, that's not a relationship, right? Think if you said that person to the person you were on a date with, right? Oh, no, you can't order that. You order, right? We would take a look at that and say, ooh, what's wrong with that person? You can't order for me. But our faith communities act like that all the time, and you know this. Act like that all the time. They say, we'll order off the menu for you. We'll tell you what it is. That's not relationship. So whether it's this kind of work or some other kind of work, if we're really going to get ourselves ready, it's got to be, we got to be willing to work on some of that stuff, and we got to be willing to speak some truth to ourselves. And, you know, God may bless us with some relationships that might help us to sort of see all that for what it is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moon, for engaging us. Congratulations on your latest publication.
Thank you, sir.
And it's my understanding that not only is this publication available this evening, that your first book is also available. Can you
It is. So this book, for those inquisitive folks, may have already found out. This is published by an academic press who doesn't think that folks like you are the audience for this book. They think some university libraries are the audience for this book. Now, we don't have to prove them wrong tonight, because none of y'all robbed a bank on the way over here. So what we need to do is we need to ask some libraries to buy this book. And once 200 hard copies of this book are sitting somewhere getting dusty in the library, I can go back to the publisher and I can say, CC, let's have an affordable paperback version of this book get printed. But that is not tonight. May God make it so in the future. So what is back there is a number of copies of the first book that I wrote, and it's an affordable book. It's designed to be affordable. It's also designed to be accessible to real folks working in real communities, to think about how to do more effective and faithful ministry with military families and with veterans. And I would commend that book to you if you're interested, and I would ask you to stand by on this book after you've requested it at your nearest university library. Is there an e-version of this? I think that there is, but I do not promise that it is any less expensive. Yep.
But someone may feel like blessing tonight.
Those copies have already sold. If you do want to purchase a copy of this, make sure that you get a discount code from me, because I can at least help with the bottom line. And if you were too enterprising, I'm sorry. You don't have to give me a Hanukkah present this year. Thank you.
We still have refreshments in the lobby, and we thank you for your presentation. We thank everyone for their presence. Enjoy.